Everybody around the world, welcome to all my subscribers. This will be my very first episode of a new series I want to get going, which will be called Stumping and Debunking Rabbi Tovia Singer and the Other Rabbis. Now, Tovia Singer has a pretty astounding reputation of being undefeated in any type of theological debate. And like every video he makes, even to me, pretty much every video he makes seems to hit really hard, like a home run. And it would make most Christians scratch their head and probably make most of them doubt what they believe. So Tovia Singer is like a powerhouse. A lot of other rabbis out there are pretty good too. I just think he's one of the best at what he does. But today, with my nice new series, I'm going to show that even the great powerhouse, Tovia Singer, and the others, they can be stumped. Because what I'm going to do with this series is for every episode, like this one here, I'm going to focus on one single topic. That way I'll keep my videos nice and short for everybody. And I'll make sure that it's a topic that will stump them. Okay, whether Tovia or anybody else. They will not be able to come back with a response or anything else like that there. They will be absolutely stumped. Okay, so without further ado, let's start off here. And I've got another episode right up my sleeve ready for this one as soon as this one is done. What I want to do for this one here, focusing on one single aspect, one perspective, one topic at a time. I've got a bunch of verses to read, and they're all going to affirm the very same thing. I think it's like 4 or 5 verses from throughout the Tanakh, right? Let's go read them real quick. From Jeremiah 33, verse 17. It says, "For thus said Hashem, not cut off to David as one sitting on the throne of the house of Israel." Okay? And if we go over to 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 17, it says, "And thou, if thou dost walk before me, as David thy father walked, even to do according to all that I have commanded thee, and my statutes and my judgments dost keep, then I have established the throne of thy kingdom, as I covenanted with David thy father, saying, There is not cut off a man to thee, a ruler in Israel." Okay, so the same affirmation. I will also read the next verse because it's relevant here. "And if ye turn back, ye, and have forsaken my statutes," instead of keeping them, "and my commands that I have placed before you, and have gone and served other gods and bowed yourselves to them, then I have plucked them from off the ground that I have given to them." Okay? "In this house that I have sanctified for my name, I cast from before my face to make it for a proverb and for a byword among all the peoples." Okay, let's go to 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 4. It says, "And thou, if thou dost walk before me as David thy father walked, in simplicity of heart and in uprightness, to do according to all that I have commanded thee, my statutes and my judgments thou dost keep, then I have established the throne of thy kingdom Israel to the age. As I spake unto David thy father, saying, There is not cut off to thee a man from being on the throne of Israel." Excuse me. "And in likewise manner," verse 6, it shows that "if ye at all turn back, you and your sons, from after me, and keep not my commands, my statutes that I have set before you, and ye have gone and served other gods and bowed yourselves to them, then I have cut off Israel from the face of the ground that I have given to them, and the house that I have hallowed for my name I send away from my presence, and Israel has been for a simile and for a byword among all the peoples." Now next, if we go to Psalm 132, okay, verse 10, it says, "For the sake of David thy servant, turn not back the face of thine anointed. Hashem has sworn truth to David." Now pay attention here. This is where it gets important. I've just read 3 verses. Jeremiah, Chronicles, and Kings. They all say the same thing, that God has promised the throne of David will always have somebody sitting on it, right? That's what God himself said. He did, however, illustrate how it's conditional, that you'll only have a king on the throne of David forever and ever if you keep his commands. If you break his commands, then you won't have a king on the throne of David, right? So we heard that. Anyway, Psalm 132 here, verse 10, for the sake of David thy servant, turn not back the face of thine anointed. Hashem has sworn truth to David. This is what we got to focus on. Hashem has sworn truth to David, because it doesn't say that in the other ones, right? He turneth not back from it. Of the fruit of thy body I set on the throne for thee. So another affirmation of the same nature, but this time it throws in God has sworn truth to David. So God's making sure he's telling everybody, look, I'm telling you all facts. Okay? And the facts are, the fruit of thy body means the descendants of David, he sets on the throne for thee. But in likewise manner, the following verse, it says, if thy sons keep my covenant, my testimonies that I teach them, their sons also forever and ever do sit on the throne for thee. Okay? So we just had 4 verses that all say the same thing. God promises Israel that they will always have somebody, a descendant of David, sitting on the throne of David. They'll never cease. But we all know that there is Hosea 3, verse 4, which says, for many days remain do the sons of Israel without a king. And there is no prince, and there is no sacrifice, and there is no standing pillar, there is no ephod and teraphim. Afterwards turn back have the sons of Israel, and sought Hashem their God, and David their king, and have hastened unto Hashem and unto his goodness in the latter end of the days. Now, Hosea 3 is important here, and everybody knows this verse. It's not like I'm shocking and surprising anybody. But what this logically shows us, as everybody knows, is that there will actually be a time, contrary to what God appeared to have said, but that there actually will be a time where Israel won't have a king. Despite the fact that in 4 verses, God made it abundantly clear, that there would always be a king. Now, we know God's not a liar. We know that there's a reason for this. Now, the rabbis might have a whole pile of other reasons, but the scriptures that we read, Jeremiah, Chronicles, Kings, and Psalms, they all specify that this promise to Israel of always having a king on the throne is conditional, because within those verses it says, if you don't keep my commands, then you won't have a king on the throne of Israel. So when God tells you in Hosea 3 that there will be a period of time where you won't have a king, you could fairly assume that, oh, maybe Israel did something naughty, maybe they broke a law and angered God, and he decided, okay, you're not going to have him for a time. But besides fussing over what we think it might be, we could do something very simple right now. If we look at history, okay, we can observably see the following. Okay, I have a list of all the kings. Okay, I'm not going to read every single one. Right? I've got every single one here going down the line. Okay? We have Hezekiah in 729 to 697 BC, give or take a range. The scholars have a range for it. Okay, but it goes all the way down the list. That was under the house of David, the restored house of David. Then we come to the Hasmonean dynasty. And then we come to the Herodian dynasty. Now, what's funny is that in history, history shows us that the last kings of Israel were literally the ones that targeted Jesus. The Herods. They were literally the last kings of Israel, and there have not been any since. Now, we know that God is not a liar. God told us in Hosea 3, many days remain do the sons of Israel without a king. And boy, howdy has it been a lot of days. I would say near 2,000 years. That's an undeniable aspect of reality. So when we go back and look at those other 4 verses, Psalm 132, 1 Kings 9, 2 Chronicles 7 or whatever it was, and Jeremiah, okay, I don't want to keep flicking the pages around, I'll get lost here. When we go look at those, it clearly says I will always give you a king on your throne unless you break my commands. Now, if history shows us an undeniable fact that there have been no kings since the Herods, okay, and combine that with, hey, well, God actually told us such a thing would happen, is very clear to see, okay, very, very clear to see that all that came true around the time of Jesus. There's no denying. King Herod the Great ruled from 37 BC to 4 BC. He died in the year that Jesus was born, pretty much. Herod Agrippa came after him. Herod the Great and Herod Agrippa were the final two kings. And that's it for Israel. So, in conclusion for this video here, this is how I know I have gotten Tovia Singer stumped and all the other rabbis. There's no way out of this. I would love to hear what you could possibly come up with in your imaginations to squirrel your way out of this one here. The simple fact is God told you, again here, in Jeremiah 33:17, not cut off to David as one sitting on the throne of Israel, unless you break my covenant. In 2 Chronicles 7, verse 17, verse 18. As I covenanted with David thy father, there is not cut off a man to thee, a ruler in Israel, unless you break my commands, it says. 1 Kings 9, right? Then I have established the throne of thy kingdom over Israel to the age, as I spake unto David the father, saying, there is not cut off to thee a man from being on the throne of Israel, unless you break my commands. Psalm 132, verse 10, for the sake of David thy servant, turn not back the face of thine anointed. Hashem has sworn truth to David. He turneth not back from it. Of the fruit of thy body I set on the throne for thee, if thy sons keep my covenant. And my testimonies that I teach them, their sons also forever and ever do sit on the throne for thee. Now, let's look at the facts, folks. We know for a simple fact that in 70 AD, the temple was destroyed. Israel essentially went into desolation. It was utterly devastated. And the Jews were scattered across the world for a 2,000-year exile, over 4 times as long as the Babylonian exile. These are undeniable facts. Okay? Tangible facts of reality. Now, how in the name of God could the rabbis, any one of them, possibly squirrel their way out of this one here? What this shows you is that all of these statements from God point towards something. You know what they point towards? Genesis 49:10, when it says, the scepter turneth not aside from Judah, and a lawgiver from between his feet, till what? Till his seed come, and his is the obedience of peoples. Now this, Genesis 49, is a messianic prophecy according to Judaism. Okay? They all believe that this is, and herald the fact that this is messianic. And this verse tells us that the scepter will turn away from Judah, okay, turn aside from Judah, when Messiah arrives. Let's look at history. When did the scepter turn away from Judah? That would be when the last kings ruled. Because after the Herodian kings, there were no more kings for Israel or Judah or anything. There were no more kings, period. Okay? Now, God is not a liar. God just told us in Genesis 49 that you're always going to have these kings, and the scepter is always going to be with Judah until Messiah comes, and then there won't be anymore. That's a fact from God. You know what I mean? Hosea 3, God told us another fact. You will have many days without a king. Doesn't that kind of tell you, when you put one and one together, that means that the Messiah has come at that point? That's why either the Messiah has come, or Israel just straight up broke the covenant and weren't worthy of whatever status anymore, right? One of the two, right? I'm going to be more favorable to Israel and say that, you know, not necessarily that outright, but that Messiah came. Okay? So when Messiah comes, the kingship ends. History shows us the kingship ended in the days of Jesus. And that for many days they would have no king, which occurred after the days of Jesus. And we know from God's own mouth that the only things that will cause Israel to cease having kings on the throne of David was either Messiah has arrived or Israel has desolated the covenant. So you take your pick. Which was it? Was it that Israel that greatly offended the covenant that all this was stripped away? After all, remember God's warning. Where was it? It says here, then I have cut off. This was in the conditional warning where if you do break my commands, he says, then I have cut off from 1 Kings 9:7, then I have cut off Israel from the face of the ground. That kind of sounds like 70 AD, does it not? Right? I've cut off Israel from the face of the ground that I've given to them, and the house that I've hallowed for my name I send away from my presence. The temple was destroyed, and Israel has been for a simile and a byword among all the peoples. To this very day we have anti-Semitism. A simile and a byword. All of this has come true. Okay? Is any of this possibly deniable? No, it cannot be. And if we go look back at Hosea 3, notice what it said in verse 4, then more importantly in verse 5. In verse 4 it says, many days remain to the sons of Israel without a king, and there is no prince, there is no sacrifice, there is no standing pillar, there is no ephod and teraphim. But in verse 5, it says, afterwards, turn back. That means after that time period. After their period in which there would be no kings, then they would turn back. The sons of Israel would turn back. This is verse 5. And seek Hashem their God, and David their king. Now, stop there. David their king, Ezekiel mentions twice that David would be the prince, the Messiah, in the end days. Now David, when this was written by Hosea, David had been long dead. David had been long dead. He wasn't talking about David was an immortal being still living on this planet like he never died. No, David had been long dead. This is talking about David when he returns as the Messiah, like Ezekiel says, in the final days. So in verse 5 here, okay, verse 4 says you're going to have this period without a king. We know that was from 70, well, just before 70 AD. It was from the time of Jesus with the Herodian kings, okay, or just after Jesus if you want to be ultra specific, okay, up until now. There's no kings, right? And it says here in verse 5, afterwards. So it's after that period when they don't have kings. They still don't have kings. After that period, turn back, have the sons of Israel, and sought Hashem their God, and David their king. Why? Because they would only turn back to God when David returns, okay, and have hastened unto Hashem and unto his goodness, in when? The latter end of the days. So God makes it very clear, the whole timeline here, okay? So, there you go, folks. That's it for the short little video. Okay, I would love to hear what the rabbis have to say about that. I could link this into many other things, but my little series here is focusing on one aspect, one perspective, one issue, one topic per video. So let this all stew over and digest in your minds, and try your hardest to come up with an explanation for this. I mean, let me try and put myself in the shoes of Tovia or the other rabbis. What could they possibly have to say? Can you deny you haven't had kings for like 2,000 years? Nope. Can you deny Israel was destroyed in 70 AD? No. Can you deny anything that I just said? No. So what are you possibly going to say? What could you possibly say? Anyways, God bless you all.